Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture, Interpreting Early Greek Auloi, a traceological approach to surviving models. I'm going to talk today and give the talk that I gave last month at Oxford. And we're redoing this talk because the recording didn't come out too well. So I'm basically going to go through everything I said at that talk. And this lecture today outlines the basic argument for an article that Caleb, Max, and I will soon publish in a peer-reviewed journal. So any feedback would indeed be greatly appreciated. Firstly, what is an early Aulos? Well, the way we're defining an early Aulos here are two pipes, two cylindrically bored pipes, approximately one tone apart from each other, and with 6 holes per pipe. Most of these instruments come from between the 6th and 4th century BC, the ones that we have that survive. Normally they're made of bone, although there are a few wooden ones. Max, Caleb, and I wanted very much to see how these instruments worked. So we took the basic measurements as written down by Stelios Psarodakis, Reiklin Moser, and Angela Bellia, and in fact, measurements that Max Brumberg himself has made, and we constructed replicas of the instruments. And what we were very interested in doing was, as I said, seeing how these were played. What we expected to get was something like this. We expected, a bit like with the Louvre Aulos and the later style Auloi that we have reconstructed, that every time we lift up a finger, we get a sort of true scale. So one note per hole, if you like, a bit like what you see on the right-hand side there. But what we were finding in particular with these early style models is that we were getting slightly odd scales, a bit like this one. And I'm going to use this scale here as the basis for the talk. All of the Auloi produce slightly different scales like this, but this is simplified for the talk. So from one pipe in particular, we got this sort of funny scale. And it didn't really line up with anything, especially since the ancient Greek sources sort of tell us that we should be expecting scales a bit like this. And this is an example of one of the modes of Aristides. So we thought there's something slightly odd here. And so we had several questions about early Auloi. What scales are these instruments indeed supposed to play? Are the originals just made badly? And can we find any clues, in fact, into how these instruments were played? And we came up with a hypothesis of fingerwear. And we thought that if we could find an original instrument with lots of fingerwear on it, we might be able to find some clues about the techniques that were played upon the instrument. And as for myself, growing up playing Scottish bagpipes, it's possible to sometimes draw conclusions about these basic techniques based off of the fingerwear patterns we see on those instruments. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. As luck would have it, we found a mention of the Browron Aulos in the Annual of the British School of Athens, volume 58. The Browron Aulos, as published by J.G. Landels. And he describes within his paper, his article, a highly preserved fragment of an early Aulos that appears to be from the 6th century BC. And Landels describes it as having indeed a lot of fingerwear on it. And so we thought, let's go and see it. And here it is. And only one pipe survives. However, the bone is very, very well preserved. And you can see some rather interesting things upon the instrument. The primary things that interested us, I will now show you now. And these are the fingerwear that we see on the holes. So if we look at hole 5 at the bottom, this hole here, we see that the hole has very little wear on it at all. The hole almost looks like it was cut yesterday because the edge is so sharp. And it really looks like nothing really ever touched that hole. So it kind of looks a bit like it could be a vent hole. And it looks like, to the trained eye, like it was never really fingered. By contrast, however, hole four, just above it, looks like it's incredibly worn. It seems to have this very large teardrop shape pattern above the hole of wear. And it really looks like a finger or something's been sliding backwards and forwards over that hole a lot. It's either that or the maker has added a groove onto the instrument in order to facilitate back and forth sliding fingerwear for the player to make. I'm going to refer in this talk to all of these things as fingerwear, but it's either going to be fingerwear from repeated use of the instrument, or it could also be some mark that the maker has made in order to facilitate this movement. And I'm not going to go into too many details about that today. By contrast, hole four, actually not by contrast, hole four also seems to have lots of fingerwear too. It's got a lot of fingerwear on the opposite side of the hole, more towards the northwest of the hole. And again, it seems that the ring finger that probably played this hole has worn the instrument out by rubbing up and down against it rather than just lifting off. And now, by contrast, hole two up here has almost no fingerwear at all on it. It's almost completely untouched. But this hole looks like the edge has been broken, which means it looks like a finger has moved up and down upon the instrument only, and it hasn't really moved from side to side. Although there is arguably a little bit of that around the edge, but less of this side to side movement wear. And again, hole one right at the top has a great deal of this wear heading towards the northeast. So it looks like the top finger has also been rolling and sliding back and forth across the bone rather than just also lifting up and down. The thumb hole is rounded all the way around the back, so it doesn't give us too many details. And I'm not going to talk today about thumb holes at all, but on all of the instruments we've observed, normally the thumb hole has been sculpted and rounded and beveled around the edge to make it easy to move the thumb, rock the thumb backwards and forwards on the back. So I won't talk so much about thumbs. So this was very interesting, and we thought, what about other instruments? So we went to several museums and we looked at other instruments. And we looked at the Poseidonia Aulos, the Brown Aulos, the Acanthos Aulos, the Pydna Aulos, and the Elgin Aulos. And by and large, we saw very similar fingerwear patterns on all the instruments. Arguably, the Poseidonia has the least, but fingerwear on them, but it's still in very similar places to where you would see it on the other instruments. And if we take a look at pictures of instruments that we haven't looked at, for example, the Ephesus Aulos, or I've seen pictures also of the Gilios Aulos, we can actually see similar wear patterns. Always we have heavy fingerwear on hole one, very little fingerwear on hole two, medium fingerwear on hole three, and heavy fingerwear on hole four. And this seems to be a very common pattern across all of these early style Auloi. And if we make an average of the fingerwear across all the pipes, it kind of comes out looking somewhat like this. So what could the wear indicate? It probably indicates that the instrument has been played. It shows us how the fingers have moved upon the instrument. The wear is either made by the fingers or it's added by a maker to facilitate the finger movement, as I said earlier. And the lack of fingerwear of any description on the lowest hole suggests that the instrument was always played with the fingers in the top position. What do I mean by this? Well, just to show how the fingers might move, I'm talking about a movement a bit like this. So in order to get those distinctive wear marks, the finger needs to be rocking backwards and forwards across the hole, sliding up and down, and over time, perhaps that creates the wear, or the maker has put that mark there in order to allow the finger to move like this, and in fact, essentially to half hole these holes. And as I said, I would come back to bagpipes. If we look here, you can see if we take a Highland bagpipe practice chanter, you can see bell finger slide wear on this bottom hole. And you'll see this a lot with Scottish Highland bagpipes and practice chanters. You'll see these sorts of a similar finger wear pattern on the lowest hole, where the finger has slidden backwards and forwards across the hole in order to produce a, well, it's in this case, it's used to create an ornament called a bell, which is a rapid sort of trill, uh, and it leaves this very distinctive finger mark. So we can see that such fingerwear also exists on other instruments. We had a hypothesis that we could perhaps play the Aristides modes on this, and we thought that the Aristides modes should line up with the fingerwear that we see on this instrument. And let me show you why. If we take one of the Aristides modes, the Dorian mode, and we line it up with one of these instruments, we get this. By the way, we have the Aristides modes are quite interesting. We have bunches of quarter tones called triplets, and then larger gaps in between. And our hypothesis was that this fingerwear was made by creating triplets. And how does that work? Well, if we cover, for example, one of the holes, and we rock the finger backwards and forwards on the instruments like this, so half holing and quarter holing the instrument, we would be able to make these quarter tones very easily that Aristides describes. And as we were starting to do this research, we noticed that our pitching was lining up really quite well with the pitching that Tosca Lynch has suggested that the mode should be played in. And in particular, we noticed that the Dorian mode was lining up very nicely. And we noticed that when we tried to play our replicas of the Acanthos and Poseidonia, Auloi, that we very much, our results were lining up with Tosca's ideas. So what we discovered was, let me show you how that would work. Here is our meze, our F. And the meze, if we were to play on the Poseidonia or the Acanthos, would be on these holes here. Interestingly, they are in parts of the instrument where there is very little fingerwear. And our triplets, and this is going to become a common theme, seem to happen in areas where there's lots of wear on the instruments. If we take Tosca's pitch to be the correct pitching. And so we can easily produce a G, G quarter sharp, and G sharp if we half hole and quarter hole the top hole of the Poseidonia and the Acanthos Aulos, a bit like this. And we can get our low triplet if we do the same thing on these lower holes here, a bit like this. And this way we can produce the triplets for the Dorian by half holing. And you'll notice that they're in parts, as I said before, in parts of the instrument where there's a lot of fingerwear, and that the meze, which normally on all of these scales has very little, is normally very far away from these triplets, is always in an area of the instrument where, well, almost always in the area of an instrument where there is no fingerwear. We also noticed very quickly that this Mixolydian scale also worked very well. So in the same way, there's a theoretical meze, which you can't actually play on these instruments. It doesn't really exist, particularly with the setup that we have come to like on the instrument. And it's it's not playable. This theoretical meze was only added to basically allow the ancients to fit the Mixolydian scales into their uh, theory of how music operates. But they do have a practical meze, and the practical meze, it's possible to play it here on the instrument. And again, you'll notice it's in part of the instrument where there's less fingerwear, whereas the lower triplet is in the same position as on the Dorian, the C quarter sharp, and C sharp, and it will be played and half and quarter hold in this area of the instrument again. And it's in a place where there's lots of wear. The higher triplet, the F quarter sharp, and F sharp happen up here, one on the thumb hole and one on the top hole of the low pipe. And that's where you get those notes. And again, you can see the triplet is in a part of the instrument where there's a lot of fingerwear. We then tried to play the Phrygian because we expected the Phrygian. It's a very common ancient mode, but we quickly ran into a problem. But one thing we noticed, Tosca had written in several papers that 432 hertz is probably a good way to. It seems to be the ancient pitch center. So we took that as our principle, and not only did we find that it was easier to play the Dorian and the Mixolydian if we tuned exactly to 432, it removed some of the problems that we had playing the Phrygian. Let me explain. Also, just to quickly point out, there was an interesting thing at the top of the Phrygian. You've got this cluster of triplets. It's a narrower triplet at the top. The quarter tones are narrower and the semitones are narrower. And we thought maybe that's to do with a limitation on the instrument. It can't quite get to the pitch of a full semitone. So maybe this is a quirk. And maybe if we try and play this on the instrument, we might find something similar. And in fact, that is exactly what we found. So, for example, if we take Tosca's pitching of the Phrygian and look again at our early Aulos scale, so the problem is that, for example, the D is very flat. It doesn't come out at 432 hertz. However, we noticed that if we pushed our reeds in like this, the internal tuning of the scale shifted, and our D was suddenly 432 hertz. And the E flat became very sharp, but with half holing, we could bring it down. So we could produce our lower triplet in the same way on these holes here. Again, in a place with a little less fingerwear. And actually, this is one of the exceptional points where the triplet covers the meze hole. And we also noticed that we could lip up to the high B flat, but we couldn't quite make it with a good reed setup, stable reed setup. You can't quite reach the B flat by lipping up, but you can almost get there. And we wonder, and we propose that the reason we have this short triplet on the top of the Phrygian, is because this is a lipped up note. It's not, you don't use fingers to uncover holes here. We also found out, and I'm not going to talk about it for time's sake, but that the tense Lydian worked in a very similar way, with a sort of similar reed setup. You have to readjust the reeds a bit, but you could also play the tense Lydian. Iastian mode was the next one, and this is again very interesting. It goes well below the range of these Auloi, or at least we thought it did. If we go back to our original Dorian setup with this slightly weird scale, and we pull the reeds out rather than push them in, again, the relationship between the notes of the instrument shifts again. And we can, here's our meze. Again, it's in a place where there's very little finger wear on the instrument. And our lower triplet can be played on now the low hole. That low hole used to produce a B flat, but now it produces an A because we've pulled the reeds out so far. And if we half hole and quarter hole that hole, we would, well, we can, in fact, get this lower triplet. When you pull reeds out like this, the top of an instrument becomes flatter a lot quicker than the lower part of the instrument. So that when we were playing in the Phrygian, that top note on that top hole was an A, and when we pulled the reed out, we were getting a slightly A flat. So we had, for the Dorian, to half hole in order to get the A flat. And now we've pulled the reed out very far, like this, we can get a G. Now, we can also, we don't have to make telescopic reeds like this. We can also make different reeds and set them up slightly differently to produce this effect. But so when I talk about extending reeds, I'm also very much aware that you can also produce other styles of reed that will also produce a similar effect as well. But I'm, again, simplifying for this talk. In the same way, we thought maybe we can play the higher Mixolydian. And with the reeds pulled out, with slight adjustments again, you have to adjust the reeds a bit. Our meze remains here on this hole. Now that's the same hole as the meze for the Dorian. But because we've pulled the reeds out, the instrument has shifted down a semitone. So we can play that note for that is now our meze and E. These lower notes here can be played by half holing here, exactly like the Phrygian mode. And this top triplet can be played here, a bit like the Dorian mode. So if we combine the fingerings and the half holings for the Dorian and the Phrygian, we can now play the higher Mixolydian. And you'll notice again that the triplets, and where you need to half hole, seems to correlate with what we see on the original instruments. And the meze is in an area of the instrument where there's very little finger wear. This also then allowed us very easily to play the Lydian mode. The E meze is still here, with the reeds pulled out like this. Again, slight reed adjustments have to be made. Our low triplet can be played here, but because you'll notice that there's actually no B that survives on this lower mode, it just goes C, B quarter sharp. And it's, again, because we've pulled the reeds out so far, the relationship has shifted. So we think that the reason the Lydian mode, this hypo-Lydian mode, doesn't have a full bottom triplet is because you can't play it. If you have a stable reed setup, you can't lip down to that low B. So you just simply don't have it. The top of the instrument is flatter, much flatter in relation to the bottom of the instrument. So again, this could just be an instrument quirk that's produced this. And again, the top triplet is played here on this hole, a bit like the Dorian mode. And in fact, the fingering for this mode is practically identical, with the exception of the low tone that doesn't exist on the hypo-Lydian, as the Dorian mode, which is very interesting. Now, this other type of Lydian Mixolydian mode that Tosca proposes is actually in the same way as the hypo-Lydian is similar to the Dorian in fingering. Well, the lower Mixolydian is similar now to the Lydian Mixolydian, and it actually requires, in this way, exactly the same fingering. So there's again another fingering that's not, you don't need to worry about learning it. And in general, actually, with all these modes, there's very few fingerings actually required to play them all if we shift the reeds in and out. Um, and you only have to operate a few fingers, and you can half hold on a few fingers, and you can play all of these modes. And yeah, as I said before, so the Dorian and the Hypolydian have the same fingering with this system, and the lower Mixolydian and the Lydian Mixolydian also have the same fingering. We haven't spoken so far about the Pydna Aulos. What we found with the Pydna Aulos is it seems to work a semitone lower than the acanthos and Poseidonia, and possibly the brown one as well. And we found that it seems ideally set to play these, in fact, lower modes. So it easily plays the lower Lydian, the Lydian Mixolydian, and the high Mixolydian. And it also allows for the bottom B on the Hyperlydian scale. The instrument requires no readjustment to modulate, interestingly, between these three modes. You can keep the reeds in the same position and get all these three modes, whereas with the other instruments, sort of we found in practice you need to shift things around a lot. So you can't actually modulate between a lot of the modes, apart from the Dorian to the Mixolydian, without adjusting the reeds on these early Auloi. And that appears to line up with the sources, I think. The hole placement also on the Pydna seems to have been modified, possibly to facilitate these modes. That's what we propose anyway. And the top hole on the high pipe appears to have been made smaller because in practice, we have found at least that you don't need a full tone at the top. You only need a semitone, and it's very hard to get a full tone between the thumb hole and the top note on the high pipe. And it does appear that that top hole on the high pipe of the Pydna is in fact slightly smaller. Another thing Tosca Lynch points out is that at some point, imperial musicians abandon the pitching, the earlier pitching where the Dorian is the central key, and they shift to the Hyperlydian as the central point of the key. And therefore, there is a discrepancy between the documents, music documents from before Christ, and of about a semitone between those documents and the musical documents that we find Anno Domini. And we propose that a common factor that remains with this shift is, in fact, the fingering. So that for example, our Dorian and our Lydian actually have the same fingering, and that this shift is influenced by the fingering. Maybe also that the Lydian becomes more popular than the Dorian at that pitch. And we actually see there appears to be some connection as well between these earlier instruments and later instruments such as the Louvre Aulos. And if we take the low pipe of the Louvre, if we take what the Dorian becomes here, we see that the half holing fundamentally still happens on the same holes. So to get our C, we have to half hole on the Louvre the same hole as we would have to half hole on the Pydna Aulos. So again, what connects the Dorian in the later period with the Dorian of the earlier period on all of these instruments, perhaps there is a commonality of fingering between all of these instruments from the early periods to the late periods. We wonder perhaps if the Pydna is a transitional instrument between the earlier classical Auloi and the Greco-Roman Louvre Auloi, later Auloi. Just to recap where we've got so far, here is if we take all of the Aristides modes and line them up, here we can see where the meze hole has to be for each of the modes, and also where the triplets are played. So the triplets here are denoted in red and the meze holes in blue. And you can see by and large that most of the mezes are in the central point of the instrument and that the triplets happen on the extremities of the instrument with our setup. And we find that, yeah, that very much correlates to the fingerwear that we see on the instruments. In practice, what we've found is that the playability of the modes kind of goes like this. The Dorian and the Hypolydian kind of feel a bit like home keys, as they appear to fit most comfortably under the fingers. That is the Dorian and the Hypolydian on the acanthos and Poseidonia and maybe the Brauron, and the Lydian, the Hypolydian on the Pydna. The higher Mixolydian, the low Mixolydian, and the Lydian Mixolydian fit very comfortable, are very comfortable to play too. And the higher Mixolydian and the low Mixolydian and the Lydian Mixolydian have exactly the same fingering, just as the Dorian and the Hypolydian have the same fingering. The Phrygian requires a little bit of extra difficulty because it requires, in our system, this lipping up technique. But that also takes into account that short triplet at the top, that narrow triplet. And the Iastian is incredibly easy to play with the reeds pulled out that long. I mean, long Auloi, typically it's easy to make a nicer sound the longer the Aulos. And the Iastian mode is the simplest to play. It only has the one triplet on the bottom, and it's, yeah, very accessible to play too. The tense Lydian is particularly a little tricky, particularly to get to the top C, but it's possible with practice. And I'm going to come on to top notes now because we haven't actually spoken about high notes. One quotation that came to mind that seems to line up with what we've been saying is the Aristoxenus on the Dorian. The enharmonic genus belongs especially to the Dorian mode, while the diatonic to the Phrygian. And we found that when you play the Dorian mode, it's incredibly easy to play the enharmonic genus, so quarter tones, because you have full control over the quarter tones and semitones with the fingers. Whereas if you play, for example, the Phrygian, you have to lip up and down, and it's a little more cumbersome. And you have full control with Dorian over this sort of thing. Summary so far: the common patterns of fingerwear across all these instruments viewed seem to suggest that there was perhaps a common Aulos school of thought. The fingerwear appears to line up with the modes of Aristides Quintilianus, and the research of Tosca Lynch. So how Tosca's pitched these modes, the modes of Aristides Quintilianus, we discovered that we could play these modes at her pitches, and it seemed to work the best. And it's by far the best way we found to play these instruments so far. Through the fingering, as well as the lengthening and the shortening of the instrument, different modes can be produced with effects described actually by the ancient sources, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Half-holing as a core technique allows for a stable reed setup and means that you do not have to push reeds in and out of your mouth in order to tune quarter tones. And it's more in line with what you expect normally from wind playing techniques by and large. And yeah, it means that you can have a very well-centered sound more easily. And it gives you a bit of stability as well when you play with this way of doing stuff, with our way. What we haven't spoken about is the top notes, and I'm going to describe to you the top notes now. But we have to, first of all, look into the basics of how cylindrical bores work. Um, what this title of this slide might seem a little concerning because I've got conical bore rather than cylindrical bore, and now let me explain. Um, Normally, we expect a cylindrical bore to overblow a twelfth, but with early Auloi, in practice, they appear to overblow a bit flatter, somewhere between an 11th or a 10th. And with the bores on these instruments, actually, we've noticed that on a lot of the surviving examples, there's a slight uh, inverse conicity towards the bottom of the bore. And this also happens to aid with overblowing flatter between this 11th and the 10th. So let me explain the overblowing thing in a bit more detail. If we overblow, the way this works is that when we cover a low hole like this, the bottom hole, the hole that's not fingered, with perhaps some wax or something, the bottom note that comes out of that is a low A flat, with the reeds in that sort of middle range setup that the Dorian mode has. Now, if we overblow that, we get a C quarter sharp or C sharp. That conical bore and everything enables sort of flexibility on if you hit a C quarter sharp or a C sharp. So let's now talk about these top notes in relationship with the modes. Now you'll notice with our Dorian mode that we set up earlier, with the reeds pushed in to midway, a midway point, we can't play a B flat. We can play a top A flat off of the high pipe and a slightly sharp version of that with a fully open hole. But we can't play a B flat. But what we can do is we can overblow to a C in the way I've just described. So we can cover all of the finger holes and cover that vent hole. And the A flat low note can overblow to a high C. And that high C is a bit unstable. You can lip up perhaps to other higher hyper modes, and you can that instability allows you to play a C easily, where with relative ease you can play a C quarter sharp and you can play a C sharp just through the lip at that point. But it's fairly easy to play a C. In the similar manner, if we pull the reeds out or create a different reed setup, we can overblow to a B, but our top note now on the high pipe is a G, which means actually we can't play an A. And it's interesting that that Lydian mode doesn't have an A. The Dorian doesn't have a top B flat, and the Lydian mode doesn't have a top A. And I think this lines up quite well with our theory. The Phrygian mode, if we push the reeds in, we can lip up that the top note on the high pipe becomes an A instead of an A flat, or a G becomes an A, and with little lipping up, with a stable reed setup, not a hyper flexible reed setup, but a stable reed setup, you can get to a B flat, but not quite a B flat, just on the edge. So it's not a very good meze note. You can never make a good meze note because it's lipped up. Hence why perhaps the Mixolydian never uses it as as an actual functional meze, only a theoretical one. The high C can still be accessed by, in practice, by covering that lower vent hole and overblowing. Although it's a little trickier because the reeds are pushed in a little further, but it's possible, and I'm able to do it in practice when I play. The Iastian mode, you'll notice, doesn't have really any top notes at all. The top note, again, like the Lydian mode, is a G, which can be accessed by the high pipe, but with the reeds pulled out, you can only really get to a high B. You can't get a B flat, and as we established before, ever, It's not possible to get a B flat. And you would kind of expect the top note, if it were possible on such a mode as the Iastian, to be an A, a high A. And it's interesting, I think, as well. This is potentially a reason why that scale doesn't have a high note. I think our theory kind of lines up quite nicely with that. You have, uh, yeah, the top note can only be a G, and you can't really overblow any note that that would help make that mode, well, extend that mode in a reliable way. In a similar way to the Phrygian, we can play the higher Mixolydian, although it's a bit difficult. Interestingly, with the tense Lydian, you can actually play it up an octave with a very similar fingering to the Dorian and the Hyperlydian modes. And because it overblows a tenth, we end up as the low note being an E, and yeah, the meze being an A, and the A comes out in the same position as the meze F for the Dorian mode. And with a very similar fingering, we can actually play the tense-Lydian an octave higher, which doesn't line up with any of the sources, but it's interesting nevertheless. The higher Mixolydian, with the reeds pulled out, interestingly, we can lip up to a high C because of that instability. There's no B in it, but which you could play, but yeah, but it's possible to lip up to that C sharp because of that sort of unstable nature of the overblown note that we discussed in the previous slide. One thing we haven't spoken about at all, which you might have noticed, is the Elgin Aulos that popped up on one of my earlier charts. In practice, what we've discovered is this instrument appears to have a very similar pitching to the coiler flute. And the fingerwear on it, which is like all of the other instruments, seems to show that it's suitable for playing Hypophrygian and Hypolydian. And it plays the Hypophrygian with the same fingering actually as the Dorian mode, and that Hypolydian with the same fingering as I earlier described to play the Phrygian mode. And interestingly, the Hypophrygian mode also has this sort of narrow triplet at the top, and this could also have something to do with a lower instrument, a bit like the Elgin Aulos, playing it. There's an alternative theory we have as to why that top triplet is a bit narrow, because it has to be lipped up similarly to the Phrygian mode. And it seems to work incredibly well when it's actually played with the coiler flute. You can use very similar fingerings on each one, and it plays and play very similar scales. And where on the coiler flute you have extra thumb holes to give the chromatics, you can just use half holing to play the chromatics on the Elgin Aulos. And by and large, all of the modes we play line up. Yeah, you can play hypo modes with the same fingerings as you would use on the Poseidonia, the Acanthos, and the Pydna Auloi to produce the normal modes. And these are the modes that the Elgin Aulos appears to play particularly well. One thing we've discovered through this process is that using this sort of reed extension, telescopic reed theory that we've developed, it seems to line up and produce colors that sort of appear in ancient sources. So, as we discussed earlier, the Dorian seems to be the best mode for playing the enharmonic, as you have full control over the quarter tones by use of fingers, as that earlier source I showed pointed out. And Dorian really feels like the home key as a result of this. And a lot of the other modes kind of feel a bit like extensions around it. But yeah, it just feels to be the most flexible of all the modes. And I don't mean to say that all the other modes are difficult to play, because they're not, but it just feels like, from my gut, it just feels like the home key. as I've said many times, the Hyperlydian feels very much the same to play as the Dorian, which as we said earlier, seems to be, yeah, it may explain the shift from the Dorian to the Hyperlydian as the sort of central point of the modal theory. The Iastian feels quite dulcet and relaxed due to the lengthening of the pipe, and if the Iastian is in fact, as some sources suggest, a sort of sympathetic sort of mode, that would kind of, I think, go along with it. It's very sort of, its dulcetness seems to be very relaxed due to, as I said, that lengthening of the pipe. Now, for the absolute opposite reason, the Phrygian feels more excited due to the shortening of the pipe by pushing the reed in further or having a reed with a shorter length stem, a shorter stem length. By having a shorter stem length, the the instrument seems has a more excited tone. So the pipe is shorter, and so it's therefore brighter. Since the Phrygian is supposed to be ecstatic mode, that kind of lines up with the source material, I think, a bit there. The tense Lydian also feels more tense for the same reason. So even shortening the pipe still further, which you sometimes have to do, it feels quite tense and suitable for lament. And I believe the Lydian is supposed to be a lament mode. And as I said earlier, you can also play it one octave higher, and even then, it obviously feels even more tense because it's from the overblown in the overblown register. The Mixolydian is incredibly comfortable to play, and I don't really have much to say about that. I mean, it just seems very sad, but more to do with the relationships of the eternal notes in the mode. So there's a lot of minor thirds and sixths, particularly if we argue that the meze is an important sort of note and is present a lot. Sources tell us that the best melodies return to the meze frequently, yeah, if we do that, Mixolydian simply feels more melancholic because as a result of the meze being in the central point between lots of minor thirds and minor sixths, it has a very sad sort of element and to it. Our conclusion, therefore, is to all of this that the fingerwear is a very strong evidence of an ancient Pan-Hellenic basic Aulos technique that uses half-holing as its sort of central point for creating semitones and quarter tones. The use of half-holing on these instruments enables for a very stable reed setup, something that in the past it's been very hard to read up these instruments and get them working using other techniques. So if you take shifting the reeds in and out of the mouth as a standard technique for playing this, it's very hard to allow for a very stable tone quality and color on the instruments. And in fact, this technique also allows for a lot of control over what you play and allows for a tone that's very easy on the ear. The fingerwear and general construction for the instrument can allow, as we've argued here, for the Aristides scales to be played on the instrument, as well as other scales in the chromatic and diatonic that we haven't spoken about, but we'll probably speak about in a future video. And that's everything. So thank you very much for listening.